I did an episode on the top 100 comic runs of all time, and coming in at number one was the run of X-Men by Chris Claremont, John Byrne, and Terry Austin. This top 100 didn't include series, so limited series like Watchmen and Dark Knight weren't included. So this run of X-Men came in at number one, and it wasn't even close. And they've been doing this top 100 since 2012, every 4 years, and every time they've run this, X-Men has come in at number one. Let's take a closer look at this run and discuss why this series is so treasured and revered by comic book collectors and readers. For the most recent list, this run excluded the issues by Dave Cockrum, which were before John's Byrne run, but for this discussion, I'm going to include them just because, they're very foundational and important to the series. The run starts with Giant Size X-Men number one, which is the first appearance of the new X-Men, which included Banshee, Colossus, Cyclops, Nightcrawler, Storm, Sunfire, Thunderbird, and Wolverine. It's really interesting to note that this was really an international group of superheroes. Here you had characters from Ireland, from Russia, from Africa, Germany, and even Canada. Immediately, a lot of tension was created within the team due to cultural and personal differences. Now, this is a fairly common theme with a lot of team superhero comic books from Marvel. It even goes back to the early 1960s with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four. What was, fairly common for the Fantastic Four was there was often a lot of infighting within the team, and it's far more pronounced with this team of X-Men. And the new characters and superheroes just look great. They even tweaked Wolverine's costume for the better, like from his original appearance in The Incredible Hulk. Now, the new series started off with a bang. You had some really significant, shocking events in the first few issues. Even in the first issue of the series, Sunfire just abruptly leaves the team. And in the second issue, which is issue number 95, Thunderbird gets killed, and these changes actually stuck. Not only did these initial new characters have a great impact, but the series also introduced a lot of other new characters that would have a long-lasting effect in the Marvel Universe. Some of the more memorable and enduring characters that were introduced in this series include the Starjammers, Vindicator and Alpha Flight, Kitty Pryde, Emma Frost, Sebastian Shaw, and of course, the Phoenix. Some of the characters like Wolverine would hit stratospheric levels in terms of popularity, but all of them developed their roots in the first 50 issues of this run. Not only did this run bring a new generation of superheroes into the mix, but it also reintroduced a lot of classic characters from the past. So this includes the original X-Men, and the linchpin in all of this is Cyclops. I think there's a bit of a misconception when it comes to the X-Men. A lot of people think that Professor X is the leader of the X-Men, and sure, he's the figurehead, but in this series, Cyclops is definitely the team leader of the X-Men, and he really shines in this run. Professor X actually doesn't appear as much as you would think in this run, and, often when he does, he's kind of a pain, he's a bit of a jerk. He certainly has his moments in the run, but on the most part, he's kind of missing in action. I mentioned a lot of the older characters were introduced in this run, but one of the most significant ones is Magneto. And to me, Magneto is always the best villain for the X-Men. Even though he kind of switches sides, in the future, to me, he is really the classic arch nemesis of the X-Men. And this really shows in the issues that he appears in. Issue 112 and 113 are two of my favorites amongst so many just amazing issues in this run. If you read some of the stories that have Magneto in the Silver Age, he's certainly the X-Men's arch nemesis, but to me, he just felt off. Too much of a megalomaniac. No doubt he's very powerful, but he just didn't have the same level of seriousness as to when they brought him back in issue number 104. Chris Claremont really gets Magneto right, and issues 112 and 113 are just spectacular. There were a lot of memorable reintroductions in this run, and it was a way to tie into the original history of the X-Men, but the creative team was selective and they chose wisely which ones to reintroduce and which ones not to. I should note the original run is actually only 66 issues because after issue number 66, they were all reprints. John Byrne may be the artist of note in this series, but Dave Cockrum did just some spectacular covers early on in this run. They are just masterpieces. There's an absolute exceptional run of covers that he did starting from about 98 to about 107 that just blow you away. In my younger years of collecting, like the wall books of stores and a convention would just be covered with these classic Dave Cockrum covers. 102 and 107 are two of my favorites, but honestly, so many of these seem to be so much better than many of the other covers from Marvel at this time. There's just this level of energy that these covers have that really is unsurpassed. What's interesting is that Cockrum would come back to the X-Men after Byrne left, and he did some decent work. And while his covers are fine, they just weren't as sensational as his earlier ones. The level of energy is just not the same. John Byrne. So his run in X-Men would catapult him into primetime popularity for comic books. John Byrne had been doing a lot of penciling during this time, from titles like Iron Fist to even the Avengers. But if you ask fans, X-Men is his best work. This is peak John Byrne. His pencils were tighter, and Terry Austin was the perfect inker for his pencils. Over the years, I've had a growing appreciation on what inkers bring to the table. Terry Austin's inks were the perfect complement to John Byrne's pencils at this time. What this series also did was it also gave John Byrne the opportunity to co-plot and write. And you can see this in the later issues. While 139 and 140 may not be the best issues, you can definitely see John Byrne having a strong influence in the story of these two issues. I really enjoyed these two issues as they also featured Alpha Flight and Wendigo and kind of centered around Wolverine and Nightcrawler. It's kind of like a throwback story to Wolverine's first appearance when he fought the Hulk. With this experience in hand, John Byrne would go on to do a fabulous run in Fantastic Four, followed by Re-inventing Superman. If you were to ask me who was the greatest artist from like 1977 to 1983, it's just hands down John Byrne. What's amazing is just his sheer output at this time. It's like Jack Kirby level. If you also talk about the 1980s, you'd have to talk about John Byrne as a writer as well, too. There were few talents like him. I think the only other comparable is Frank Miller, who did penciling and writing for Daredevil. John Byrne was critical in the success of the new X-Men, and X-Men was critical in the development of John Byrne's talents as a writer and artist. His penciling wasn't quite the same after he left X-Men. It was a little looser, not as sharp. Whether it's different artists inking his work or whether his style got a lot looser, it just didn't have the same feel. But there's no doubt he became a superb all-round talent. If you're a long-time collector, you'll know that these back issues of X-Men have always been expensive. If you look at any of these older catalogs from Mile High or other mail-in catalogs in comic books, you can see how expensive these back issues were. These X-Men comic books were expensive back in the 1980s, and they're still expensive today. Take a look at this ad from Mile High in 1980. If you look at the price for X-Men 94, it's $50, which sure doesn't feel like a lot today, but when you compare it to other back issues at that time, it's very expensive. There's another interesting thing to note about these older mail lists. I had a great conversation with one of my viewers with regards to how pricing has changed for comic book collectors over the years. What drove back issue prices decades ago, now we're talking like 30 plus years ago, it's not so much about key issues or first appearance, but prices were often driven by stories, as well as collecting full runs. Prices were often highest for first issues and then progressed lower for later issues, with the exception of the occasional anniversary issue or special issues that had significant events, like the origin of a character or the death of a character. Back then, collectors were more interested in stories and key events. They want to find out about how a superhero became a superhero, or whatever huge tragic event happened in one of the storylines. First issues are also a good starting point for collecting a run, and believe this or not, X-Men 94 was actually more expensive than Giant Size X-Men at one time, just because it's basically the first issue of the run. As popular as this run has been over the years, there was actually a time when the prices for this run went down, and that was when they released Classic X-Men. And this makes sense because they started reprinting all these issues starting from Giant Size X-Men number 1. Like I said, for a very long time, back issue demand was driven by collectors wanting to read these issues, not necessarily what are called key issues. And at that time, reprints usually meant a big blow for back issue prices. And comic book store owners who relied on back issue sales really hated it when publishers reprinted back issues that sold well at a premium. Because all of a sudden, a lot of their back stock was worth less and wouldn't sell as well. As a comic book reader and collector, why should I pay $30 for a back issue when I can get a reprint for $1? Well, you can ask then, well, what about all those other reprint titles that Marvel did, like Marvel Tales that reprint Spider-Man, or Marvel's Greatest Comics that reprint Fantastic Four? Well, there comes a time when back issue prices can kind of like crystallize, when either the nostalgia effect or something else will trigger, collectors to buy original issues instead of the reprints. It's, not easy to kind of pinpoint exactly when this happens, but, if you look historically, this has happened quite often. To me, this is a really interesting topic, and I'd like to revisit it again. So the viewer I had this discussion with regards to, how collecting habits have changed as well as pricing, his name is Jerry Lucky, and he wrote this in-depth article you can check out on Bleeding Cool. I'll provide a link to this article in my video description, and he goes into a lot more detail about how these collecting habits have changed. Definitely worth your time if you're curious about this kind of stuff. Now, even though I've been a longtime collector, I've actually never owned the complete run of the new X-Men. And actually, I've never owned a copy of Giant Size X-Men #1. Well, as I said, just because these have always been expensive back issues, and, I'm kind of a cheap collector. But I do have a lot of nice copies, and I'm happy to show you some of the examples in my collection. I've had a number of my X-Men copies graded, and the issues that I've had graded range from number 100 to about number 141. And the reason why I got these graded, I thought the condition of the books, warranted that they get graded, as well as at some point, if I ever do want to sell these books, I find that graded copies, specifically higher grades, will command a higher market price. But that being said, in my experience in talking with other dealers, this run of X-Men, they always sell well, graded or not. And because these issues have always sold historically well and are very popular with collectors, they are pretty easy to sell, whether if it's to another comic book store or online. I also have a number of X-Men books that I'm not showing here that are not graded. I would say I have about 70% of the Chris Claremont, John Byrne, Terry Austin run. Some of the earlier issues, like specifically the Dave Cockrum ones, I don't have as many of, but I do have a few. And again, I'm not in any particular rush to always buy these. Whenever I see like a good opportunity to pick an issue up that I don't have, I will. Again, because these sell very well, it's not always easy to find good deals on X-Men. Arguably, the greatest story arc in this run is the Dark Phoenix Saga. An interesting factoid is that the original ending crafted by Claremont and Byrne was kiboshed by Jim Shooter. Given how much damage Dark Phoenix had done, Jim Shooter felt like, they were letting her off way too easy in the original ending that they had thought for issue number 137. Now, incidentally, 137, I wish they didn't have this, win $2,500 prize label on it. It just feels like it ruins the cover, but, well, what can you do? They actually released a special issue called Phoenix the Untold Story, and you can actually read both endings, as well as a discussion among Chris Claremont, John Byrne, Jim Shooter, and other people that were involved in the entire event. And, there were a lot of voices in this conversation. Honestly, the discussion amongst the people here is worth the price of admission alone. Now, my personal favorite story in this new X-Men run is actually Days of Future Past, which is issues number 141 and 142. It starts off with a great cover, perhaps my favorite in the run. If you're not familiar with the story, there's a lot of, going back and forth in time. And this can be a tricky thing, but Claremont and Byrne do it beautifully and brutally in this 2-issue story arc. And even to cap off the run, issue number 143, which is just a single issue story, it's fantastic. It features Kitty Pryde, and the amount of energy and intensity in this issue is superb. And it's a Christmas issue to boot. Tying in this run all together is Chris Claremont, the writer, and what a run he's had on X-Men. Starting with Giant Size and then finishing, I'm not even sure when. It's incredibly rare for a writer to have this kind of run in a series, working with a variety of different artists and a number of memorable story arcs. So kudos to Chris Claremont for having the longevity, the foresight, and just the creativity to create such memorable stories and characters. So you have great characters, great villains, a writer and artist at the top of their game, and you have an unmatched 50-issue run of comic book storytelling. If you've never read it, you're in for a treat. I believe these issues still hold up incredibly well. And if you have, it's certainly worth revisiting again. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you found this one interesting, you can check out another one of my episodes over here. Until next time, read and enjoy your comic books.